Tell me when. Alright, so welcome back. You notice I was hot before, drenched in buckets of sweat, and now I'm cold. So, wearing long sleeves now. So anyway, we're going to wrap this up now. Now, in light of what you've all seen about the migrations, now we're going to get into Genesis 49 to decipher where those tribes are today. Now, Genesis 49, this is, each one of these tribes will be a specific nation. So this is just determining what nations they are and tie it in with the migrations and the linguistic aspects we discussed. This isn't to say, oh, only these people or that tribe. It's just talking about the nations that fulfill those prophecies. But first, we're going to get into the tribe that inherits the birthright. We'll get to the big kahuna first and go to the other guys. And so, Judah has the scepter, but not the birthright. He doesn't get the double portion. And typically, in scripture, traditionally, the firstborn gets the birthright, but in Scripture, we see that's usually not the case. Solomon being a prime example of that. So we're going to start with Abraham, where the birthright was passed down to, and then what promises, what birthright blessings were given to that tribe and inherited. Then we'll identify the birthright tribe. Okay, so, Ishmael was the elder son, but Isaac got the birthright. And so Esau didn't get the birthright. He forfeited that to Jacob. Now Reuben is Jacob's firstborn, but he didn't get the birthright either because he defiled his father's concubine, Bilhah. That's why he got disinherited. You'll see that in Genesis 35:22 and 1 Chronicles 5:1-2 what Reuben did, how he lost the birthright. So, since Reuben didn't get the birthright, it was passed down to Joseph and his sons Ephraim and Manasseh. So this is the birthright tribe, and we're going to identify who they are. But first, we're going to list the birthright blessings they were promised to help us identify these cats. So if you go to the next slide, please. The first birthright blessing, Genesis 12:2. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. You go to the next slide, please. Genesis 17, verses 4-6. As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be called Abraham. For a father of many nations have I made thee. And I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. You go to the next slide, please. Genesis 18:18. Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. Next slide, please. Genesis 22:16-17. And said, by myself have I sworn, saith Yahweh, for because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. You go to the next slide, please. Genesis 24:60. And they blessed Rebekah and said unto her, thou art our sister, be thou the mother of thousands of millions, and let thy seed possess the gate of those which hate them. You know, the next slide, please. Genesis 27:29. Let people serve thee, and nations bow down to thee. Be master over thy brethren, and let thy mother's sons bow down to thee. Cursed be everyone that curseth thee, and blessed be he that blesseth thee. You go to the next slide. And Elohim said unto him, this is Genesis 35:11, I am El Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall be of thee, and kings shall come out of thy loins. Go to the next slide. We'll get into this in a minute. So what are the birthright blessings? Well, So Ephraim and Manasseh, this is going to pass down, you will see here, you're going to be a great and mighty nation. Many nations. He's a father of many nations, Abraham, not just one nation. A company or a commonwealth of nations in some translations. And they will possess the gates of their enemies and those that hate them. It's mentioned twice. And other nations will bow down to them. And this is pretty big stuff. And we already covered all the tribes can't be Jewish. And this, Judah has the scepter, not the birthright. This is not traits, blessings that Judah got. And we're going to get real specific here. So in Genesis 48, this is when Jacob blesses Ephraim and Manasseh, the sons of Joseph. And we had to read the whole chapters. There's a lot of details people miss. It's the key to unlocking this. And it came to pass after these things that one told Joseph, Behold, thy father is sick. And he took with him his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And one told Jacob and said, Behold, thy son Joseph cometh unto thee. And Israel strengthened himself and sat upon the bed. And Jacob said unto Joseph, El Shaddai appeared unto me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and blessed me. And said unto me, Behold, I will make thee fruitful and multiply thee. And I will make of thee a multitude of people. And will give this land to thy seed after thee for an everlasting possession. And now thy 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, which were born unto thee in the land of Egypt, before I came unto thee into Egypt, are mine, as Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine. And thy issue which thou begettest after them shall be thine, and shall be called after the name of their brethren in their inheritance. And as for me, when I came from Padan, Rachel died by me in the land of Canaan in the way, when yet there was but a little way to come unto Ephrath. I buried her there in the way of Ephrath, the same as Bethlehem. Now you see, Joseph was Jacob's favorite son. So he's passing the birthright unto him and his sons. You're going to see that in a minute. And it came to pass after these things that one told Joseph, Behold, thy father is sick, and he took with him his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And one told Jacob and said, Behold, thy son Joseph cometh unto thee, and Israel strengthened himself and sat upon the bed. And Jacob said unto Joseph, El Shaddai appeared unto me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and blessed me. Oh, wait a second, I already read this. Someone's not heading next. There you go. Man, don't I look stupid now. And Israel beheld Joseph's sons and said, Who are these? And Joseph said unto his father, They are my sons, whom Elohim hath given me in this place. And he said, Bring them, I pray thee, unto me, and I will bless them. Now the eyes of Israel were dim for age, so that he could not see. And he brought them near unto him, and he kissed them, and embraced them. And Israel said unto Joseph, I had not thought to see thy face, and lo, Elohim hath showed me also thy seed. And Joseph brought them out from between his knees, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth. Now this is where we really got to start paying attention, because this is significant. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near unto him. And Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it upon Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand upon Manasseh's head, guiding his hands wittingly. For Manasseh was the firstborn. And we go to the next slide. And he blessed Joseph and said, Elohim, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac did walk, the Elohim which fed me all my life long unto this day, the angel which redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads, and let my name be named on them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. We keep seeing this word multitude here. This is going to mean something later. And when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand upon the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. And he held up his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head unto Manasseh's head. And Joseph said unto his father, Not so, my father, for this is the firstborn. Put thy right hand upon his head. And his father refused and said, I know it, my son, I know it. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations. You go to the next slide. And he blessed them that day, saying, In thee shall Israel bless, saying, Elohim make thee as Ephraim and as Manasseh. And he said, Ephraim before Manasseh. And Israel said unto Joseph, Behold, I die, but Elohim shall be with you, and bring you again into the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given you thee one portion above thy brethren, which I took out of the hand of the Amorite, my sword, and with my bow. Now, before we go on to the next slide, this is significant because you get a visual. Jacob is blessing Ephraim and Manasseh. And so, he's got Jacob, he's got Ephraim and Manasseh. He's blessing them, like this, laying hands on them. Now, Manasseh is the older one, but he's given Ephraim the double portion. Then Joseph corrects Jacob. He's like, no, father. And he moves his hands. This is how it should be. Vice versa, he got mixed up. Then Jacob's like, not so, son. This is how it should be. Now, this is no accident because Jacob, or Israel, was prophesying on the future of Ephraim and Manasseh, and so was Jacob. You read this and think, so was Joseph. You think, Joseph just wants his eldest son to be blessed. But he's prophesying too, the Ruach, the spirit of Elohim's guiding all this. So this is, just keep this visual in mind. Jacob's blessing Ephraim and Manasseh. Joseph crosses his hands and he crosses it back. And again, let's stick. So what's significant about this is that Ephraim got the birthright blessing Manasseh should have. Then Joseph fixed his father's hands and fixed him back. So at first Ephraim will get the birthright blessing, and then Manasseh, who's the eldest and should have gotten it, will get it back later. The cross in the hands is very significant. So you go to the next slide, please. Keep this in mind. All right, now, Genesis 49, when he blesses all of his sons, all the tribes, we're focusing on Joseph now. Genesis 49, 22 through 24 says, Joseph is a fruitful bow, even a fruitful bow by a well, whose branches run over the wall. The archers have sorely grieved him and shot at him and hated him. But his bow abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty El of Jacob. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Now, go to the next slide. And so, first I'm going to identify each tribe and explain why these nations are these tribes. Ephraim is Great Britain. Manasseh is the United States. I'll explain why. So, you can go to the next slide. Now we'll get into this in a minute, but let's set up the premise. A great and mighty nation, many nations, a multitude of nations, a company of nations, or a commonwealth. Other nations will bow down before you. Kings will come out of your loins. Okay, so, and we're going to get into why these nations rose to prominence in just a short period of time out of nowhere. But definitely great and mighty nations. We think of the British Empire and the United States. And they achieved this, especially the United States, in such a short period of time. We're becoming a nation, and we're going to see why. However, this map right here, remember, Ephraim and Manasseh would possess the gates of their enemies, and the gates of those that hate them. Now what do we have here? The red is Ephraim, that's Great Britain, the British Empire, what used to be it. And the blue is the United States. And it's hard to see the United States land and sea gates on here. Now, look at the British Empire, all these land and sea gates. Yeah, these territories they conquered, especially the sea gates in strategic locations. Well, you can't see on here, but Gibraltar, we got that from Spain. All these territories they conquered, these are land and sea gates. From enemies, you know, that they beat in a war, they will possess the gates of their enemies and those that hate them. And talk about the company and the multitude of nations. Look at how Ephraim's all spread around. Now the United States got many sea gates in the Spanish-American War. Just give a quick example. You know, Puerto Rico, Guam, they used to control Cuba, and the Philippines. And what's the most astonishing is the Panama Canal. That the United States, I don't know if they still do it, they used to control that. That was such a strategic trading port, you know, that when they keep getting these land and sea gates, they just keep growing and growing in power. And the gates of those that hate them, I mean, this really hits your enemies in a sore spot when you take a strategic location like the Panama Canal. And these are the only nations that fulfilled that birthright blessing prophecy to Abraham. It's very specific. He will possess the gates of his enemies and those that hate him. Well, this is what they mean by gates, land and sea gates. And some of the locations like Gibraltar and the Panama Canal literally are gates to other places. That's very specific. So if you go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And now, we're going to examine this. This is the United States seal. Now, this really is important what this phrase means, the Latin phrase e pluribus unum. But you're going to see the number 13 in this seal a lot. That Latin slogan, that's 13 letters. Now, there are actually 13 tribes of Israel, because Ephraim and Manasseh are their own independent tribes. A lot of people don't catch that. Now there are 13 stars. Now look closely, the way these stars are formed, that's the shield of David. And then we'll go about the Star of David, the correct term is the shield of David. And then there's the sun. We'll get into why there's a sun here in a minute. The pillar of cloud. It appeared over the Israelites in the wilderness. 13 arrows, 13 leaves and 13 berries, 13 stripes. And this is the eagle. It's this symbol, a crest, a herald of Dan. That means judgment. Okay, so now let's examine these two things right here. Remember, the archer shot at him and grieved and hated him, but his bow was made strong. In the scriptures, the bow is a symbol of military power or might. And the archer shot at Manasseh and grieved him and hated him. Now, Ephraim and Manasseh are starting to lose their birthright promises. You see especially the United States, declining in economy, losing wars. But back in the heyday, no one could beat Manasseh, the United States. So you got 13 arrows, and that ties right into Genesis 49, 22 through 23. And he's a fruitful bow who goes over the wall. There's your fruitful bow right there. And so if you go to the next slide, please. Now what does this sun mean? Well, this ties into the dream Joseph had in Genesis 37, verses 9 through 10. And he dreamed yet another dream, and told it his brethren, and said, Behold, I have dreamed a dream more, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. Notice he mentions 11 stars, and then he has 2 sons at the birthright. That's where your 13 tribes come from. And he told it to his father and to his brethren, and his father rebuked him and said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee, to the earth. Remember, one of the birthright promises was other nations will bow down to you. Alright, so keep the sun and the moon made obeisance to me in mind. So you go to the next slide. Now this here is an earlier version of the United States presidential seal. So of course you see the arrows and the fruitful bow, the eagle, and the stripes. But what's curious here is in this version of the seal there's moons. How many? 13 moons. So one seal you have the sun and the others you have the moons. And this, once again, at number 13. Now I'm not saying that whoever designed these designed it that way on purpose. I believe that the Father guided them unwittingly to make them this way, as the Father's given us clues. As remember in Amos 9:9, it says, not one grain shall be sifted. Everyone will be able to be identified.
Is that stars underneath those moons?
Yes.
It looks like stars underneath the moons.
Right, oh yes, there's 9 stars and then 3 down here. So you got the traditional number 12. Let's see, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Right. So, yeah, that's, I don't know if that part's significant, but since most people think there's 12 tribes, you know, that, but yes, those are stars. But hold on a second. Yeah, because he said the 11 stars made obeisance to me, but there's 9 stars underneath here. So, but the other seal is more significant, but there's many similarities. But here you get the part of Joseph's dream about the moons, the 13 moons. So if you go to the next slide, please. And so the question is, why did the United States just spring out of nowhere and in a shorter period, you know, because other nations were around hundreds of years before them, but yet the United States became the most powerful nation in the world in just a short period of time. But what took so long? What was all the holdup? We're going to figure this out. Why was the birthright blessing withheld? In Leviticus chapter 26, verses 14 through 18. But if ye will not hearken unto me, and will not do all these commandments, and if ye shall despise my statutes, or if your soul abhor my judgments, so that ye will not do all my commandments, but that ye break my covenant, I also will do this unto you. I will even appoint over you terror, consumption, and a burning ague, that shall consume the eyes and cause sorrow of the heart. And ye shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it. And I will set my face against you, and ye shall be slain before your enemies. They that hate you shall reign over you, and ye shall flee when none pursueth you. And if ye will not yet, for all this hearken unto me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins. So, we're going to tie it somewhere, but keep this in mind, 7 times. And he will punish the Israelites 7 times more for their sins, withhold the birthright because they did not obey his commandments. And you go to the next slide, and we'll tie this into the other. Okay, so we're going to use some tricky math here, kind of tricky. And so, if we remember the 7 times, well, a time is usually a biblical year. It's like in Revelation 12:14, they tell the tribulation is time and time, a time and times and half a time. Most people interpret it as 2.5 years. And so I'm going to take a time as a biblical year. And so in Numbers 14:34, it says, after the number of the days in which ye search the land, even 40 days, each day for a year, shall ye bear your iniquities, even 40 years, and ye shall know my breach of promise. You see that? Keep this in mind. 7 times at 7 prophetic years, but each day for a year shall ye bear your iniquities, and ye shall know my breach of promise. He's going to breach his promise to them for a while. And in Ezekiel, I think chapter 4, we see the prophet Ezekiel laying on one side for the iniquities of the house of Judah, the other side for the iniquities of the house of Israel. And he did a day for a year, just like in here. So you go to the next slide. And we're going to get to this real soon. But, okay, so he said, you will know my breach of promise. Now, we're going to use a little timeline. Is in 2 Kings 17:18, I believe that's it. That is when the northern kingdom, Israel, says Yahweh removed Israel from the land and out of his sight. And so from that year, now there's many variations depending on whose years you use, but I've tried many combinations, so it all ends up to the same result. But for the sake of simplicity, we'll do this. The time, according to Ivan Panin's numbers, and they're only like 3 or 4 years off from the other Bible historians that determine these years. It's about 690 BC, about that time, or roughly in that range. So that is when Israel was removed from the land, the northern kingdom of Israel. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. Yeah, 7, I will punish you 7 times for your sins. And for the sake of simplicity, we'll just go with this date, about 690 BC, or in that range, and 360 days for each biblical year. 360 days is one biblical year. 1 time times 7. That is 2,520 days. Remember, Yahweh said in Numbers 14:34, each day for a year ye shall know the breach of my promise. So that is 2,520 years. And when you take that date, that Israel was removed out of the land and from Yahweh's sight, and fast forward 2,520 years later, you get this date. The Louisiana Purchase, when the United States territory boomed, and they were really seeing their birthright promises and blessings. Now Ephraim got the double portion first. He was the top dog. Remember, there was 13 original colonies. And then Manasseh took back his birthright and got independence from Ephraim. And then after that 2,520 year withholding, they boomed. That's when they surpassed Ephraim. So you see how that all ties in. And so then you go to the next slide, please. Now, we're going to identify the other tribes and why these nations are at tribe. So Reuben, we will identify as France. And in Genesis 49, this is when Jacob's prophesying about all the sons. He says, Reuben, thou art my firstborn, my might, and the beginning of my strength, the excellence of dignity, and the excellency of power. Unstable as water, thou shalt not excel, because thou wentest up to thy father's bed, then defiled thou it. He went up to my couch. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to see some traits in the French that line up with Genesis 49, verses 3 through 4. Now, in Judges 5:15 through 16, the Reubenites declined to fight in the battle against the Canaanites under Deborah and Barak. So they were neutral. we're staying out of this. Now, during, so the French didn't want to fight with the United States in the war in Iraq a while back. And during World War II, the French yielded to Nazi pressure. And rather than fight alongside with Britain, they begrudgingly cooperated with the Nazis and coexisted with the Vichy government at the time. And so, however, it says that Reuben is unstable as water. Now there's this term called a French leave, where you just up and leave with no notice for no reason. Shows the French being volatile, unpredictable. And during the 70 years of the Third Republic, more than 100 cabinets succeeded one another in France with an average tenure in office of less than 8 months. Now that's pretty unstable. Even the Encyclopedia Britannica calls this Third Republic era French history unstable. And since they're unstable as water, well, now remember how the French, they helped the United States in the Revolutionary War. And with the Napoleonic Empire, they used to be not opposed to fighting, but then with some other, see, you don't know what Reuben's going to do. He's unstable as water. Sometimes he fights, sometimes he doesn't. We see that early on in the book of Judges. Now, isn't this interesting? The Napoleonic Empire tried to get control over Europe from Britain. So Reuben's trying to take his birthright back from Ephraim, and when he lost the Napoleonic Empire lost to the British, well, then he decided to help Manasseh some passive-aggressive way, just to get back at Ephraim. I just think that's kind of funny. But evidently there's some significance to that. Now, it says, Reuben, thou shalt not excel. So, he will have, now Deuteronomy 33:6 says that Reuben's men shall not be few, so he'll still be populous. And actually, thou shalt not excel, that also is translated as thou shalt have no preeminence. So he'll be a close second to Ephraim and Manasseh, but he won't get the birthright blessing. And you can kind of see that with the Napoleonic Empire and otherwise. So, Reuben, the excellence of my dignity. Well, the French are very dignified, even to the point of being kind of stuck up. They have extreme pride in their culture, their food, their monuments. In fact, in France, there's something called the Toubon law, which you can't even use English words in public schools. They want to preserve their language so much. And these are similar laws in French, Canadian, Quebec. And the last identifying trait of Reuben is, what was Reuben? He was sexually immoral, perverse. He defiled his father's concubine, couldn't control himself. And the French are known for loose sexual practices and appetites, always satisfying appetites, particularly with food too. They're hedonists. I mean, although they didn't invent it, they credit French kissing with them. And when French officials are caught in sex scandals, they really don't care in France. It's not like here where Bill Clinton is put on trial for it. Not that that was right what he did, but just the French have a more loose attitude towards sexual immorality. We even see that with Marquis de Sade, probably one of the biggest, most famous perverts of all time. The dude was French. Then we'll go to the next tribe now. Now Zebulun, we will identify as the Netherlands. And we have two clues here, two prophecies. Genesis 49:13. Zebulun shall dwell at the haven of the sea, and he shall be for a haven of ships, and his border shall be unto Zidon. And in Deuteronomy 33, Moses prophesies about the tribes as well. And this is what he says about Zebulun in verse 19. They shall call the people unto the mountain. There they shall offer sacrifice of righteousness. For they shall suck of the abundance of the seas and of treasures hid in the sand. Okay, so go to the next slide, please. Now, let's get that. Now, it says Zebulun shall be a haven for ships. Well, what's a haven? It's defined here as a shelter, a safe place, or of refuge, or it's also a port or a harbor. This is the Rotterdam port in the Netherlands, the gateway to Europe as they call it. Now, from early on, and this still is, thank you, the busiest seaport in Europe, if not one of the busiest seaports in the world. And go to the next slide up. Okay, now, where was I? Oh yes. So the Dutch invented a very advanced dijken system here. And so that, remember in Deuteronomy 33 was talking about he shall suck the treasure out of the sea from the sand. Well, this that Hebrew word that suck is translated from is the same term used for an infant sucking from his mother's breast. They'll suck it out of the sea, out of the sand in that sea. Well, what is typically in the sand under the ocean? And what treasure did the Dutch suck out? If you go to the next slide, we'll identify what that was. Everyone knows shell gas? It's owned by the Dutch. It's also called Dutch Royal Shell. That's the treasure they sucked out of the sea. And they were right in the perfect strategic location for that. And so he's the haven of ships, and he sucked the treasure out of the sea, all in that perfect location. Now, could someone please just get me a water bottle in the cooler? Thanks. So, another clue here, the last part of Jacob's prophecy of Zebulun, is that, I mean, there's the cooler on the floor. It has a... The last clue is that his border shall be unto Zidon. Oh, thanks. Well, that Hebrew word border, it actually means thighs. And it's different than the other legs. I should have put what Hebrew words were up there, but like in Daniel, I think, when it's describing the statue of Nebuchadnezzar, you know, the legs and the thighs and legs are two separate Hebrew words. So the border, so you're into the thigh region unto Zidon. That's also Sidon, Sidonian. Now the Sidonians were loose in sexual practices too. Jezebel is a Sidonian princess, and the Baal worshippers, you know, the Phoenicians, the Sidonians engaged in a lot of sexual rituals, pagan worship sex rituals. Gives us a clue, and the border, the thigh region, well, what is in the Netherlands? What's in Amsterdam? The red light district. I mean, people go to the Netherlands here to smoke pot, or, you know, well, you got a reason why they go there. I mean, that's one thing they're known for. So they fulfill all those prophecies very specifically. Now, if we go to the next slide, we'll close with Zebulun, something very interesting. Now, during the 80 Years' War, the Spaniards tried to conquer, but towards the end of the 80 Years' War, the Spaniards tried to conquer the Dutch province of Alkmaar. This was about 1576. Okay, and there was a specific battle in the province of Alkmaar. This is called the Siege of Alkmaar. There's a town in the province of Alkmaar called Horn. And the Spanish admiral, Bossu, tried to conquer the town of Horn, but failed. And what you see here are three adjoined houses in the town of Horn. This is called the Bossahusen House, named after Count Bossu. Although these phrases here, these are actually, it's like a monument to taunt. Well, not really taunt, it's just the victory the Dutch won against the Spaniards. And you notice the haven of ships. You got ships all over these friezes. So if you go to the next slide, we'll zoom in on this house right here, particularly this region, this plaque on the frieze. Now, I will give you the translation in English. We go to the next page. But notice what you have here. You have Amalek and Israel. So if you go, whenever you're ready, just go to the next slide. I'll tell you what this means in English. That plaque you saw, it's in English it reads, "Oh happy times, oh grand golden message. Everyone who remembers it must rejoice. The country shakes and trembles. The enemy shakes and trembles. The enemy is drawn near. With the help of Amalek, he wants to slaughter all Israel." Now, if that doesn't flip your switch, I don't know what will. But once again, it's a pretty revealing clue in light of everything else we just found out about Zebulun. Now, if you go to the next slide, please. Now, we have identified the tribe of Issachar as Finland. Now, his prophecy is in Genesis 49:15. Issachar is a strong ass, or donkey, couching down between two burdens. And he saw that rest was good, and the land that it was pleasant, and bowed his shoulder to bear, and became a servant unto tribute. Now, what are the two burdens that Issachar the donkeys couched between? Well, for a while, Finland didn't get its independence until much later. Depending on how you define independence, right around 1918 or so. But Finland is couched between two burdens. At one point, Sweden completely controlled and dominated Finland. And then the Russians dominated Finland for a while. So it was couched between two burdens. One master ruled it, not at the same time, but at separate times. So Russia and Sweden fought for control over Finland. Let me go to the next slide, please. Now, a tribe named Tokhari migrated with the Masagati and other Saki tribes through Russia. And Tola was the name of one of Issachar's sons in Numbers 26:23. That's a clan of Issachar. Now, Tokhari is a composite word of Tola and Issachar. And there's a Russian city, Tula, to this day, I believe, when the Masagati, it's the Issacharites, the Tokhari with the Masagati, when they passed through Russia, that name, that Russian town, gives us some clues before they arrived in the region of Finland. Now, so when Russia ruled Finland between 1899 and 1905, the Russian Tsar fixed an annual tribute for Finland to pay. He's a servant unto tribute, and we're going to see that pattern in their history. Now, the Finns volunteered in the armies of Russia and Germany in World War I. They saw some independence restored in 1917, but in 1918 they signed a peace treaty with Germany called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, or how do you pronounce that? Now, the Russians attacked Finland as World War II began. The Finns put up a heroic resistance, but then had to sign a treaty ceding territory to Russia. It's called the Winter War. When Germany attacked Russia in 1941, Finland briefly allied itself with Germany before signing an armistice with both Great Britain and Russia in 1941. At the end of World War II, Finland had to pay war reparations to the Soviet Union. See, he keeps having to pay tribute to everyone. He's a servant under tribute. And you know how good he is at paying tributes? Finland is the only country that paid back all of its World War II debt to everyone, the United States, the Soviet Union. It was the only country to this day that's paid back all its debt. And he learned to be real good at coughing up them ducats, paying those tributes. And so anyway, as you know, some people are just meant to be the donkey and be burdened and pay everything. But to their credit, they did put up a lot of heroic resistance and won some remarkable battles. So anyway, we'll go to the next slide. The tribe of Dan. Now Dan has a huge migratory path, but primarily today we've identified Dan as Ireland and Denmark. Genesis 49:16 through 17 says, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path, that biteth the horse heels, so that his rider shall fall backward. So go to the next slide, please. So this is a condensed migration map of the tribe of Dan. Okay, so he's, like a serpent's path, like a serpent's trail. Look at this winding path of all of the migrations of Dan. Just follow the lines. Now, you're going to see this pattern with Dan, and it says in the scriptures too, whenever Dan goes somewhere, he names the places after him. It's kind of like, a little kid says, well, I don't see your name on it. Well, Dan, he got his bases covered as he puts his name on everything. There's no mistake what's his. Like Danae, the Danube River, Danzig, or De Danans. It's in Hibernia, the ancient name for Ireland. And what was Denmark's, actually, when you translate it into Danish, Denmark is Danmark. If you go to the next slide, please. When you're done, helping everyone see that map. Yeah, be with us today. For just showing you the serpent's trail, the serpent's path of the winding migrations of Dan. Okay, so Deuteronomy 33:22 says that Dan shall leap from Bashan. That was an area of Palestine, and they leapt and just kept leaping everywhere. Now Judges 5:17 records that Dan lived in ships. They were the seafaring people, and that's why they migrated all around. Now where's that pattern of Dan naming places after him? When Joshua in 1947, Dan renamed the city of Lashem Dan. Okay, this is our city, we're naming it, the other brothers ain't getting it. Okay, so we're going to just discuss briefly the migrations of Dan. Now the Tuatha De Danans, that's what secular history calls them. The Tuatha De Danans, even when you fudge up the semantics and linguistics with Greek and Roman terms, it's so obvious who they are. The Tuatha De Danans migration is recorded in the early histories of Ireland or Hibernia. The Danans fought a 3-day battle to establish a homeland against the Furbolgs, which centered around a hill called, which they named later, Ben Levi. After which they built many stone forts. 2 forts on the Irish islands called the Arans are named Dún Allongasa and Dún Concuir. Now you see, sometimes it's Dún, but when you remove the vowels, you know, DN, that's pretty much Dan. Okay, and so there was sea raiders, these seafaring sea raiding people, recorded in by the Egyptian and Greek historians that traveled in those same migratory paths we saw on the map. Okay, now the Greeks and the Egyptians called them the Danauna and the Sakari. The Greeks called them the Danans, the Tuatha De Danans. These sea raiders that were active in the Levant is another term for the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, Sakari, that's what the Egyptians call it. Zak is a Hebrew form of Isaac. The sea peoples, that's what they call them, well, they're the sea peoples, with all these different names, had roots in Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey. And the region of Anatolia associated with ancient Troy used to be called Dardania. The Tuatha De Danann arrived in Ireland around 721 BC. After the Saki arrived, the Black Sea's rivers were renamed. The most prominent one was the Danube River. Okay, so if you go to the next slide, please. I'm not sure if there's something after this. And then I'll tie in the prophecy of the adder biting the horse's heels, assuming there's nothing about Dan after us. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you.
Oh, I thought it did go.
No, it was ornery. Okay, we'll get to this in a minute, but first it said that, you know, that Dan is an adder in the path. He shall bite the horse's heel so the rider falls backwards. Well, the Irish, at least most of Ireland, not Northern Ireland, but the Irish gained their independence from the British, the rider. And the snake bit the heels of the rider and it fell backwards, you know, knock it right in the, so that they fall backwards and they got their independence. And notice the analogy here. It's a snake that's subtle biting the heels of the horse, so it falls back, throws the rider off. This is not open warfare. This is referring to guerrilla warfare, much like the tactics the Irish Republican Army uses. And an interest in is, I don't need a picture, so you all know what the famous "Don't Tread on Me" flag looks like. You know, they used many American wars, particularly the Civil War. It has that adder, you know, the snake, and it says, "Don't tread on me." He's the adder in the path, and that is another indication of some form of guerrilla warfare. That's pretty interesting. Now, Gad, we have identified as Germany. Now remember, though some Germans are Assyrians, and we discussed that briefly earlier, but we're identifying most of Germany as Gad. And there's 2 clues. Genesis 49:19, Gad, a troop shall overcome him, but he shall overcome at the last. Deuteronomy 33:20 says, and of Gad he said, blessed be he that enlargeth Gad. He dwelleth as a lion, and teareth the arm with the crown of the head. So if you go to the next slide, please. Now, the Kermans, remember the Kermans, the Carmanians, those were the Assyrians. But then there was the Germani, which are the Parthian tribes. They migrated through the Caucasus Mountains towards Europe in huge numbers. And there was 4 major subdivisions of Germanic people that migrated into Europe that the modern-day Germans stem from. Remember we talked about the Alemanni, the Franks, the Saxons, and the Goths. And there's a German region called Saxony. The German word for Saxon is Saxis and Saxe. It was pretty close to Saki, actually. Now, remember it says, a troop shall overcome him, but Gad shall overcome at the last. Now, because these people, they're all intermingled with the Assyrian Germans, you know, they do kind of mingled in. Like it was talking about Gad shall be enlarged. Well, the German Empire used to be pretty big, the Prussian Empire, and it compared him to a lion tearing off the crown, you know, a predatory, warlike nature, which is definitely exhibited in the history of Germany. And a troop shall overcome him, but he shall overcome at the last. Now, after World War II, the Germans became one of the most prosperous and wealthy, well-to-do nations in the world, particularly European nations. But you notice in the Germans' history, they exhibit a lot of peaceful characteristics. You know, like, for example, contributing to music, classical music, literature, the Gutenberg printing press, and whatnot. So we see these two sides of Germany, and since the Assyrians happened to get there, you know, you have the predatory, warlike nature. Then you also have this other side of the Germans. And remember the Berlin Wall? Well, Western Germany boomed. A troop shall overcome him, he shall overcome at the last. But Eastern Germany never quite got up to snuff with Western Germany in terms of prosperity. So what does this indicate? Well, the people in Eastern Germany probably maybe are not necessarily Israelites and didn't receive the blessings that some of those other Germans did. Now, we'll get to them last, but Simeon and Levi are scattered amongst the tribes. They have no nation of their own. We'll get to them briefly last. But one of their prophecies is they dug down a wall in anger. Now, this is just a theory of mine, but I was just wondering if Simeon and Levi are scattered, if they dug down a wall in anger, if that referred to the Berlin Wall. I'm not saying that's fact, just a little thought I had. You know, you can go to the next slide now. Okay. Now, Asher, you have identified as South Africa. And the prophecy for him is in Genesis 49:20, which says, out of Asher his bread shall be fat, and he shall yield royal dainties. So you go to the next slide, please. Now, this is kind of archaic. When it says his bread shall be fat, that pretty much is indicating prosperity. And so he shall yield royal dainties. You know, royal, that's the Hebrew word melech, which means king, and I forget what the dainties, but that can also be translated delight. So he shall be prosperous and give kings delights. Okay, now what is it with these kings' delights? Whenever people visited kings, when people visited, you know, monarchs from other countries, visited Solomon, for example, or just customary throughout history in general. Not even the Israelites, and particularly in Israelite history, gold was given as king's delights. Now, in Numbers 26:45, a branch of the Asherites were the Hiberites, indicating Hibernia. Now, they were active in the ancient Phoenician mining activities from the building of Solomon's temple. The Hiberites, these Asherites, were actually, some of their mining posts were in Iberia too. And they were in with the mining activities. Because they went on the ships, the Israelites did some labor overseas and at home, and as with the Phoenicians, they did a lot of labor in that Middle Eastern, Palestinian regions. Okay, now, the South African company De Beers is a pretty famous precious stones company. 94% of the world's diamond output in 2003 came from De Beers. And most of their mines are centered in South Africa. South Africa is a hotbed for mines. 50% of the world's gold reserves are in South Africa. That indicates their mining nature, giving kings delights and having fat bread and being prosperous. Now the Boers are the Afrikaans, the South African language, the Afrikaans, that the original settlers spoke. The Boers or Afrikaans are a mixture of British and Dutch people. Now Zebulun and Asher lived side by side in ancient Israel, and Zebulun's the Dutch, so kind of another clue. If you go to the next slide, please. Now we have identified Naphtali as Sweden. Genesis 49:21 says, Naphtali is a hind let loose. He giveth goodly words. And so, you go to the next slide, please. Now, Naphtali is one of the easiest tribes to trace their migration because in 2 Kings 15:29, as you recall, the entire tribe of Naphtali was taken captive before the fall of Samaria. Now, another large mass group of people called the Yuchi were being pushed from Inner Asia towards Scythia and Parthia. Early Chinese chronicles indicate these groups of Huns were the Hephthalites, but their names changed over time. Their original name was the Naphtalites. Now, if you don't see, that was practically unchanged, and they kept their tribal name longer than the other tribes up until the 7th century AD. If this doesn't give you a clue, I'm sorry. You need to have your head checked. If you don't see that's obvious, the Naphtalites. Okay? Now keep in mind, this isn't to be confused with the other Huns, like Attila the Hun. The other historians group the Yuchi all together. But these Naphthalite Huns were quite different than the other Huns. Okay? Because the Naphthalite Huns were their capital's called Sakawa, very similar to Saki. They were pushed towards Scythia and Parthia and intermingled with those people. Now their capital, Sakawa, ruled their own kingdom in the region of Afghanistan and West India for a while. And they migrated into Sweden eventually. And now the book of Tobit, now I'm saying this is an apocryphal book, I'm not saying this should be in the Bible or anything, it's not canonical, but it parallels 2 Kings 19:37, mentioning the death of the Assyrian king Sennacherib at the hands of his sons and then fleeing to Ararat or Armenia for refuge. The book of Tobit also shows in chapters 1 and 14 that a family of Naphtalites maintained contact with each other as they were resettled in Assyria and the cities of Medes. The book of Tobit shows that the Naphtalites lived in Ecbatana in Media when Nineveh fell. Secular history calls Ecbatana a Scythian city. So you see a connection. So we'll wrap up Naphtali. Remember that brief clue. Naphtali is a hind let loose. He giveth forth goodly words. Well, a hind is a female deer, and she's let loose. Let loose in the wild, in heat, the female deer. Doe, a deer, a female deer. And so, okay, now, when America's sexual morals started to get more loose, the sexual liberation movement, these Swedish actresses like Ursula Andress, or Dr. No, James Bond, and Anne Margaret when this influx of Swedish actresses into Hollywood, that brought the idea of blondes have more fun, that kind of changed America's perspective on sexual values. I'm not trying to be lecherous, but this is the only way to resolve that prophecy in light of the migrations and everything. And Naphtali giveth forth goodly words. Well, what are the goodly words? Every year in Stockholm, the Nobel Prizes are held. That's the goodly words, my friends. And as I don't think that it's all talking about these female deers prancing around in heat, these blonde women, the goodly words whispering sweet nothings in your ears. That ties into the Nobel Prize ceremony. So if you go to the next slide, please. All right, now we have identified Benjamin as Norway. In Genesis 49:27 says, Benjamin shall raven as a wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. So if you go to the next slide, please. Okay, now, in Judges 19, chapters 19 through 21, a civil war between the Benjaminites and the other tribes erupted. Although the Benjaminites were outnumbered 400,000 to 26,700, they won the first two battles as they routed the combined forces of the other tribes. The entire tribe of Benjamin was eventually reduced to only 600 men. So they're tenacious and fight tooth and nail even when it's foolish. And since they were only around 600 men after the Civil War with the other tribes, they are one of the least populous tribes, probably in fact the least populous tribe. Okay, now the Israelites were living in Asia Minor during the Apostolic era, as evident by the opening of Peter's first epistle. Now Saul of Tarsus, who everyone knows as Paul the Apostle, was born in this area of Asia Minor, and he was a Benjaminite. Now the area of Galatia, they were also called the Gauls of Europe. Okay, and so now let's tie in some clues here. They're tenacious fighters, even to the pretty bloodthirsty. They raven as a wolf, they devour the prey and divide the spoil. Who does that describe? The Vikings. Now the Vikings actually carry that concept of that Hebrew tradition of blowing on a ram's horn. They called it the buka horn. Now let's think about this wolf thing. Wolves are not just the predatory, ferocious nature, and how Norway has barely any people despite its huge countryside. Wolves are indigenous in northern climates, and indicating that Benjamin's Latter-day Territory will be in a northern latitude. And we've already ruled out the other northern latitude countries, and thus, now the last clue for Benjamin, unfortunately I couldn't find a picture. It's in a book and I didn't scan it, so hard picture to find. But Norway was going to use the wolf as their official symbol at one time. Now when the Nazis, that is the Assyrians, came and stormed into Norway and took over, Norway, I couldn't scan this picture in time, Norway was building a wolf column, a big column with a wolf on top, howling, to be their national symbol, but the Nazis destroyed them all, and there's only one photo existing of this wolf column. That's a pretty interesting clue. Then we go to the next slide, please. Here we got to the last guys. Simeon and Levi. Genesis 49, 5 through 7. Simeon and Levi are brethren. Instruments of cruelty are in their habitations. O my soul, come not thou into their secret, unto their assembly mine honor, be not thou united. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they digged down a wall. Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So Simeon and Levi, there's a parallel here because, they did to Dinah's Goy husband Shechem, without Jacob's approval, just slaughtering all of them. They don't have a nation, specific nations of their own. They're scattered amongst all the other tribes. But we can still find out some clues about them. So if you go to the next slide, please. Okay. Now, Simeon and Levi, they're instruments of cruelty. Now, Simeon, throughout the scriptures, had a warlike nature. And see, well, you can tell by Genesis 34, they're basically the shoot first, ask questions later people with a propensity for violence. In fact, the Levites, well, what was their job? The sacrifices, blood and guts. These people aren't squeamish. There's the character trait of them. In fact, Simeon, to illustrate his cruelty, he was the leader of the effort to kill Joseph before he was sold into slavery. And in Genesis 42:24, Joseph put Simeon in a prison while he sent the other brothers left to Canaan. I mean, this guy, Simeon, like their father, daddy knows best. They're instruments of cruelty. Now, 2 Chronicles 15:9 and 2 Chronicles 34:6 mention that Simeon joined Ephraim and Manasseh. So even though Simeon scattered, he's mainly amongst these dudes. And since the tribe of Levi was disenfranchised by Jeroboam and sent to the southern kingdom, they're mainly with Judah. But they're scattered amongst everywhere. Okay, now, there was a tribe that arrived shortly after the Danites, around the same time. They arrived in Breton, the old name for Britain. This tribe, these people were called the Simoni. Once again, if you don't see the connection, I'm sorry. I don't know how else you're going to see something that obvious. While many Israelites were fleeing from Assyrian captivity, the Simoni migrated to Breton. Their Celtic descendants were fierce warriors that limited advances from the Romans and the Saxons into the British Isles. Because remember, the Romans wanted to conquer Britain, and we discussed earlier. Well, who was preventing the Romans from getting into Breton? Who were the fierce warriors, the Simoni. Eventually, those descendants were pushed westward into Wales and northward into Scotland. They migrated along with Dan, as I mentioned earlier. Now, Sparta helped Carthage and established a colony in Carthage named Taras. Tara was the name of one of the places the Israelites pitched in Numbers 33:27-28 when they were wandering around, the wilderness. And Terah was the father of Abraham. We see that in Genesis 11:31. A city of ancient Ireland was also called Terah, since the Simoni migrated with the Danites. So you go to the next slide, please. Yes. No. Yeah, this one, yes. Okay, so we noticed the Spartans had that, were intermingled with the Parthians. They had some relationship there. Now this is a really big clue here. The Jews and the Spartans had a fascinating correspondence in the 2nd century BC. You see this in the first book of Maccabees. During the Maccabees' revolt from the Seleucid Greeks, a Jewish leader, because remember the Maccabees trying to get independence from the Seleucids, a Jewish leader, Jonathan, sent a letter to the Spartans. You'll see this in 1 Maccabees 12, verses 5-18. Jonathan, the high priest, and the rest of the Jewish people send greetings to their brothers, the Spartans. They're calling them brothers here. In former times, a letter was sent to the high priest Oneas from Arius, who was then a king among you, to say that you are our kinsmen, brothers and family. As the copy of it that is appended to this shows, we have undertaken to send to renew relations of brotherhood with you, as it is right and proper to remember kinsmen. Then we see Arius, the king of the Spartans, sends his reply back to Jonathan in 1 Maccabees 12, 19-23. Arius, king of the Spartans, sends greetings to Onias, the chief priest. It has been found in writing concerning the Spartans and Jews that they are kinsmen, and they are descended from Abraham. Now, since we learned this, please write us about your welfare. Okay, so even though Simeon's scattered, we can definitely pinpoint them in that region. And thus, what are the Spartans famous for? Their tremendous fighting abilities. It's legendary. People practically, drool over it. The movie 300. Their superior, fighting skills and tactics. And 300 Spartans defeated all those Persians. Remember in the book of Judges, chapter 6 or 8, Gideon's army of 300 defeated all the Midianites. Super warriors, I see another scriptural parallel to the exact number. And, Levi, we see these traits among them, but Levi also were the musical talent in the temple. So perhaps, of course that's subjective, but perhaps people with musical talent as well, that's scattered among them, could be identified more specifically. Now this is worth investigating, although this is the biggest clue that I've studied myself about the Simeon, but Levi might be hard to pinpoint otherwise. Well, anyway, we'll close with just some words from other people, what they say about all this information I presented to you people. Go to the next slide, please. Now, the rabbis say, because Rico, if the rabbis say it, must be true. Now, let's see what some Jewish people said about this information I presented. This school of thought. I believe the 10 tribes to be in various parts of Europe. Maimonides. Well, that guy's a big wig. Everyone knows who that dude is. He counted all the commandments to be 613, right? And then we saw, Eldad and Josephus backing up this information we presented. Maimonides concurred with Maimonides. Now, Moses ben Isaac Edrehi was a Moroccan-born rabbi and Kabbalist. He believed the lost tribes of Israel were also located in Europe. And he wrote in his book the historical account of the 10 tribes, written in 1836. And he chronicled a lot of the information that we discovered. And he specifically mentions in an excerpt from his book here, Ortelius, the great geographer, given the description of Tartary, notices a kingdom of Arsarat, where the 10 tribes retired and succeeded other Scythian inhabitants and took the name Gother, the Goths, because they were very jealous for the glory of Elohim. In another place he found the Naphtalites, who had their hordes there. He also discovered the tribe of Dan in the north, which has preserved its name. They further add that the remains of ancient Israel were more numerous here than in Muscovy and Poland, from which it was concluded that their habitation was fixed in Tartary, from whence they passed into neighboring places. It is no wonder to find the 10 tribes dispersed there, since it was no great way to go from Assyria. Either they were transplanted, having only Armenia betwixt them. So all these places, these migrations and historical accounts we discussed, not only were backed up by Josephus, Eldad, or the other Jewish historians, Maimonides agree, and Moses ben Isaac Edrehi, a rabbi and Kabbalist, wrote a whole book about what we just talked about. Do you go to the next slide, please? This is the last slide. And Eliezer Basin, a 19th century Russian Jew of aristocratic origins, wrote in his book British and Jewish Fraternity, 1884. He equated Britain with the Israelite tribe of Ephraim. And this is an excerpt of what he wrote. The Hebrew scriptures, the Tanakh, point to the British Isles as the home of Elohim's firstborn, i.e. Ephraim, the collective name for the 10 tribes. And he cites Jeremiah 31:9. It is my conviction that Britain is a nation with whom Elohim has from first to last identified himself. I, an Israelite of the house of Judah, claim you as Israelites of the house of Ephraim, or the house of Israel. As believers in the faithfulness of our covenant-keeping God, I call you to awake from your sleep. Here, Eliezer Basim, a Russian Jew of noble origins, aristocratic origins, royal origins, and encouraging the British to wake up and realize who they are. And the Jewish Encyclopedia begrudgingly backs up this information we presented, but of course it kind of beat around the bush. The Jewish Encyclopedia notes the identification of the Saki or Scythians with the 10 tribes, because they appear in history at the same time and very nearly in the same place as the Israelites removed by Shalmaneser, is one of the chief supports of the theory which identifies the English people and indeed the whole Teutonic race with the 10 tribes. The Jewish Encyclopedia, 1901, volume 12, page 215. And finally, in 1900, S.J. Deutschberger, a Jew and the head of the Industrial Mission of the Jews, became General Secretary of the British Israel Association. So, I'll just close with these words. You see all this historical accounts and supports from Jewish people. It only became hostile. They only became hostile to this truth. It actually started to decline after Israel became its own independent state in 1948. Kind of curious. And once these neo-Nazi chumps cherry-picked this information, not realizing their stupidity, and they ruined this truth that's undeniable by scripture, history, archaeology, and other things. Well, I'm telling those people now, we're taking it back. And acknowledging two-house theology, it says it right there in the Tanakh. The Old Testament, there's two houses. There's no way around it. Acknowledging two-house theology is not conflict with being Jewish or Judaism. Yet we still acknowledge who Judah is. We just want to clear up who the other dudes are. And so, now that we've cleared up this information in an objective and historical and scriptural manner and tied it all in, well, what are you going to do with this information out? If you are a two-houser, just find this out for the first time, or what if you're someone else find this out for the first time? What will you do with it now? And remember, Amalek, you see him with the wrong.